You know that feeling when life just feels heavy, like you're carrying this invisible backpack full of worries, maybe frustrations?
Yeah, we all know that feeling. It's pretty universal.
But what if the core reason for that underlying struggle, is actually something quite, well, fundamental, something we might overlook?
That's a great place to start. Across many different ways of thinking, people have explored this dissatisfaction really deeply. And today we're focusing on a key concept from Buddhist teachings, tappa, which essentially boils down to the cause of suffering.
Right, tappa. And we're diving into this based on a YouTube talk by Thich Chan Quang. Now, our aim here isn't really to analyze the speaker or get tangled up in, super complex philosophy.
No, not all.
It's more about trying to grasp the heart of this specific teaching. Think of it maybe as a quick way to understand a core Buddhist perspective on this.
And by understanding tappa, you, listening right now, can hopefully gain a really practical lens to look at your own experiences of unhappiness. It's about getting a clear, relatable insight into why those heavy feelings pop up.
So our goal today, unpack this idea of the cause of suffering as it's presented in the talk. Make it easy to understand and see how it connects, to our actual lives.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's get into it. The talk starts by looking at something that might seem a bit backwards initially, the order of the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because the Buddha first talks about suffering itself, ko, before explaining its cause, pup.
Right. Why do it that way?
Well, the speaker in our source points out that it's kind of like identifying the problem before you figure out what's causing it, which in a way makes a lot of sense, practically speaking.
Yeah, okay, I see that. Diagnose first, then find the cause. And as we touched on briefly before, koa isn't just about traumatic pain or tragedy.
No, it's broader. It's also about that inherent unsatisfactoriness, the sort of impermanence that's just part of being human, part of this cycle of existence we find ourselves in.
That low-level hum of things not being quite right, maybe.
Kind of, yeah. Or just the understanding that nothing stays the same, and this constant change, even when things seem fine, can lead to a sense of unease.
Okay, so with that understanding of suffering ko as the starting point, the talk then really zooms in on what fuels the suffering.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the speaker distills it down to one central idea: selfishness.
Selfishness, yeah. And what's insightful here is how the talk interprets the original teaching. The ancient Pali word is I, which often gets translated as craving or maybe attachment. But in this context, in this talk, it's primarily explained through the lens of selfish desire.
So it's important to get that distinction right. It's not saying all love or all desire is bad.
Exactly. It's not about condemning love itself, but specifically that kind of love or desire which is rooted in a self-centered perspective. Yeah. That's what leads to trouble, according to this teaching. It's like a sticky clinging to what I want, my pleasure, my needs.
That makes sense. That distinction is really key. Now, someone listening might be thinking, hold on, isn't ignorance, isn't that the deeper root of suffering in Buddhist philosophy?
That's a very valid point, and the talk does acknowledge that.
Okay.
Ignorance, or vomin, is indeed considered the more fundamental cause, absolutely. But the speaker here seems to focus on selfishness as maybe a more accessible entry point for understanding.
Easier to grasp in daily life.
Yeah, exactly. Vomin can be quite abstract, often something people understand more deeply through meditation and direct experience. It's kind of like looking at a complex computer bug. Maybe you start with the obvious faulty connection before you trace it all the way back to the core code. Selfishness is that more immediate connection.
Right. More direct, relatable cause for our everyday struggles.
Got it.
And the talk then links this selfishness to another important concept, chupung, which we can understand as ego, or maybe attachment to the idea of a separate, permanent self.
Precisely. If we look at the big picture again, this ignorance, this vomin, leads to a basic misunderstanding. The belief in a solid, unchanging me. And this illusion, that's what fuels the selfishness we're talking about. Now, this ego isn't always loud and obnoxious, like demanding attention.
Yeah.
It can be really subtle. Just quietly influencing our thoughts, our actions, often without us even realizing it's happening.
So it's not necessarily shouting, "Look at me," all the time. It could be as subtle as, constantly comparing ourselves to others on social media, or feeling personally attacked when someone disagrees with us.
Exactly, those kinds of things. It's that underlying sense of I and mine that just color so much of our experience. And the talk gives some really practical examples of how this selfishness shows up day to day.
Okay, like what kind of examples are we talking about?
Well, take just this simple desire for pleasure.
Hmm.
It seems natural, right? But if we dig a little, we might see how even that pursuit can be driven by a self-centered desire for my enjoyment, often without much thought for how it affects others, or even ourselves long term. There's also this constant nagging feeling of being distinct and separate from everyone else. That feeling comes directly from this ego-driven selfishness.
And the talk mentions those fleeting moments, doesn't it? Maybe when we feel deeply connected with nature or someone we love, or even in like intense moments where that strong sense of I just seems to dissolve temporarily.
Right. Those moments hint at the possibility of something else, the illusory nature of this solid, separate self. It points towards interconnectedness, doesn't it?
Yeah, the idea that we're all part of something bigger, which is the total opposite of the isolated self the ego builds up.
Exactly.
Okay, so this selfishness, this constant focus on me, what are the consequences?
Yeah.
The talk breaks down the suffering that comes from it into 3 main types.
Yeah, and it's useful to see the different layers. First, there's the obvious psychological suffering. You know, the worry, the anxiety, the restlessness that seems to come hand in hand with selfish desires. Always wanting more or fearing losing what you have. That constant churn.
That makes sense. And the second type?
Then there's actual physical suffering. The effort, the hardship, the literal work we put in trying to satisfy those selfish desires.
Right, the long hours, the sacrifices we make, sometimes burning ourselves out, all in pursuit of something I want.
Exactly. And then there's the third type, which is maybe a bit deeper. The suffering of karmic consequences, or yikbao.
Yipao, karma.
Thinking about this from a broader perspective, our actions, especially when they're motivated by selfishness, they have ripples. They create consequences. Negative actions we take to achieve selfish goals can lead to future pain, future hardship. Not just for us, but maybe for others too.
Like what sort of things?
The talk uses examples like ruthless business competition, being dishonest to get ahead, that kind of thing.
So, it's the idea that our actions create a kind of momentum. And selfish actions tend to create negative momentum down the line.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And the talk then explains how this whole cycle of suffering keeps going, fueled by our experiences and how we react to them.
How does that work?
Well, what's crucial to understand is how even pleasant experiences can keep us trapped in this cycle. When we have a pleasant sensation, the term used is thought. It often triggers craving, which is I.
Thought leads to I. Sensation leads to craving.
Right. And that craving then reinforces our selfish patterns as we try to grasp and hold on to that pleasure or get more of it. The example of addiction really nails this, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
The initial enjoyable experience creates this powerful craving, I, which then drives selfish actions to repeat it, often with really harmful consequences for everyone involved. It's like being stuck on a treadmill of wanting.
It really is. In the talk, it's very specific with examples of these selfish desires and the not so great outcomes they often lead to.
These concrete examples really help ground the idea, I think. Take the desire for wealth. Seems normal, maybe even good.
Sure, we all need money.
Of course. But the selfish desire for excessive wealth can lead to constant anxiety about finances, huge pressure to work harder and harder, maybe cutting corners, maybe even acting unethically to gain more. Again, those actions carry that karmic weight we talked about.
Okay, what else?
Addiction, as we mentioned.
Yeah.
Whether it's substances, gambling, shopping, anything really, it stems from that selfish desire for a particular feeling, a particular sensation. And it almost always ends up causing harm, reinforcing that self-centered focus.
And what about things like jealousy, envy, that feeling of oko?
Ah, yes, oko. The talk explains how this desire to be better than others, or to have what others have, which is rooted in that selfish comparison, leads to negative thoughts, maybe negative actions, and ultimately it just isolates us.
I think everyone can relate to feeling that sting of envy at some point. It really does create this kind of internal friction, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it's corrosive.
And interesting to connect that directly to this idea of a selfish desire. I want what they have.
Precisely. And there's an anecdote mentioned about someone who got rich through deceitful means, only to lose it all later. It serves as a kind of stark reminder of how fleeting selfish gains can be and the potential for things to swing back around.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? The talk doesn't just point out the problem, it points towards a way out of this cycle too.
Definitely. And what's significant here is the shift towards the alternative. The talk introduces the idea that living for the benefit of others, vitha, actually leads to genuine happiness.
Altruism.
Yes, which is presented as the direct opposite of the suffering that comes from selfishness. So it highlights this potential for a real shift in how we experience life.
And that brings in the idea of our conscience, doesn't it? Lum tam. That inner sense of right and wrong.
Exactly. Thinking about this broadly, this inherent sense of conscience, lung tam, is presented as something uniquely human. It's what allows us to, hopefully, tell the difference between ethical behavior and just raw selfish impulses. It's like a natural guide.
But just having that inner voice isn't quite enough, is it? The talk seems to stress the importance of nurturing it, developing it through learning ali, ethical and moral principles.
That's a really key point. While we might possess this conscience, it needs cultivation, it needs strengthening. Learning ethical principles, ali, provides the structure, the understanding needed for that development. The talk even expresses gratitude towards teachers like the Buddha who've shared these guiding principles over centuries.
Which then leads naturally to an important distinction the talk makes between true and false teachings, Chandao and Tadao.
This brings up the need for discernment, doesn't it?
Yeah.
True teachings, Chandao, are those that illuminate what's right and wrong, helping to clarify and strengthen our conscience.
No.
False teachings, Tadao, on the other hand, can actually cloud our judgment, obscure our conscience, and potentially lead us towards harmful behaviors, maybe even causing a regression in our moral standing. The talk cautions against teachings that might sound good, but actually mislead us.
So what's the real key then for making actual spiritual progress, according to this perspective?
Well, the talk really emphasizes that the core of spiritual practice lies in developing wisdom, tritut.
Tritut, wisdom.
Yeah, this wisdom is what allows us to clearly distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad, skillful and unskillful actions, kin ak tui fuk. This wisdom is presented as the essential tool for actually overcoming that deep-rooted selfishness.
It warns against thinking there are easy shortcuts, right?
Yeah.
Like some kind of magic formula, maybe just chanting a mantra or something.
Absolutely. What's crucial to understand, according to this talk, is that overcoming deeply ingrained selfishness isn't usually quick or easy. It's a gradual journey. It cautions against believing that simply doing one practice, like maybe just chanting or only trying to achieve a quiet mind, is enough on its own.
Without ethical awareness.
Exactly. Without a strong foundation of ethical understanding and conduct, those practices might not actually get to the root of the selfish patterns.
Which naturally leads to the mention of the Eightfold Path, I imagine.
Precisely. The Eightfold Path is briefly mentioned as the comprehensive framework. It's the whole package, designed to cultivate that wisdom, the ethical conduct, and the mental discipline needed to truly overcome selfishness and the suffering it creates.
So if selfishness is the core problem here,
then the Eightfold Path is presented as the roadmap out.
Got it. Now, the talk also touches on this idea of freedom, which, you know, in the West especially, sometimes gets interpreted as just doing whatever you want, whenever you want.
Right. And what's insightful here is the relationship the talk explores between freedom and responsibility. It points out that unlimited freedom without strong ethical considerations, can easily lead to actions that harm ourselves and others. It highlights that delicate balance between individual liberty and the well-being of the whole community, the whole society.
What kind of examples does it use?
It brings up things like the potential harms associated with readily available pornography, or the excesses sometimes seen in nightlife culture, suggesting these can arise when freedom isn't guided by ethical awareness.
It's that classic idea, my freedom ends where your nose begins kind of thing, but applied more broadly to well-being.
Sort of, yeah. And it leads into a really interesting contrast between how Eastern and Western perspectives often approach happiness.
How so?
Well, if we consider this broadly, Western cultures often place a very strong emphasis on pursuing sensory pleasure, external achievements, material success as the primary routes to happiness.
Yeah, that seems fair.
In contrast, the Eastern perspective, as presented here anyway, emphasizes things like restraint, ethical behavior, cultivating wisdom, and finding inner peace through practices like meditation. The talk actually mentions 4 types of happiness.
4 types.
Yeah. The pleasure we get from our senses, sure, but also the joy that comes from helping others, that altruism, bitha, the satisfaction of intellectual understanding, and the deep, stable peace found in meditative states.
That's a really different focus, isn't it? Away from just chasing the next high towards something more internal, maybe?
Internal and perhaps more sustainable. And the talk actually ends with a kind of hopeful note about the future.
Oh.
There's this sense of optimism expressed, a belief that maybe Western societies might increasingly look towards Eastern wisdom for a more balanced approach, maybe recognizing the limits of solely chasing external pleasures.
Interesting thought. And there's a direct invitation for you, the listener, right? To think about your own life.
Absolutely. The encouragement is really to examine your own actions, your own motivations, to actively strive to live according to ethical principles, whatever they mean to you, and to contribute to a more positive world by consciously choosing paths that are less driven by those purely selfish desires.
So to really boil it all down, the core message from this deep dive into Tup as presented in the talk is that selfishness, while it can feel so natural, so ingrained, is fundamentally the cause of so much of the struggle and suffering we experience.
That's the central argument, yeah. And the immediate next step, maybe, for you listening, is just to take some time for some honest self-reflection. Consider the ways selfish tendencies might be showing up in your own life. How might they be affecting your well-being, your relationships?
Not always easy to look at.
No, definitely not, but worthwhile.
Yeah.
And we've touched on the path forward, that Eightfold Path. That's definitely something we could explore in more detail in future discussions, the actual how-to.
Okay. So ultimately, the talk suggests that just recognizing this root cause, seeing selfishness clearly for what it is and the effects it has, is the absolutely crucial first step towards finding a way to ease that suffering.
Exactly. It offers hope. Hope that by understanding these underlying drivers, we can start to make different choices and cultivate a life with maybe a little less suffering and a greater sense of genuine peace and connection.